Hello and welcome everybody to the Week 13 edition of the Football Diehards DFS show with Jamie and Eric. I am Jamie Calandro at JAC3600, joined as always by my co-host Eric Romoff at Fantasy Nav. We didn't do a Week 12 for over the Thanksgiving break one, so we're back and we're hoping to help you get some money for DFS Week 13. We have 6 full weeks left of the DFS season, so let's check in a little bit. Eric, how was your Thanksgiving? First of all, we didn't really get to chat, and how was the DFS going that week?
Yeah, Thanksgiving was glorious. We went and hid in the mountains of Lake
Thanksgiving break
Tahoe.
one, so we're back and we're hoping to help you get some money.
And the day was made all the better by a pretty nice win on the DFS side. Had a good amount of Isaiah McKenzie as one of my core plays, so kind of rotating around that made for a pretty profitable day.
Awesome. Yeah, I had a good Thanksgiving day. The main slate wasn't so good. This Sunday was one of those days when I just kind of tinkered my way out of victory. You know, I had Garrett Wilson pretty much locked in all week, and then when it looked like Michael Carter was going to be the play with like check down Mike White under center, I pivoted to him and pivoted off Garrett Wilson, and it looked like I was going to salvage the day anyway, and then Josh Jacobs went and crushed that all with that last touchdown right at the end. So it wasn't to be on Sunday. So looking for a bounce back this week. We got a huge slate to cover here. Only 2 teams on bye, the Panthers and the Cardinals. So we've got 12 games on our main slate. Little bit of business, first of all. I mean, again, if you're with us right now, thank you. As always, hopefully you've listened to us in the past and we've helped you win. If you're new to the show, welcome in. We do take questions in the chat on YouTube. There's already one there, which we'll get to before we start breaking down the games. But what we do here is we'll go game by game and break each one down from a DFS perspective, primarily on DraftKings. But if you're a FanDuel player and you have FanDuel questions, we can certainly answer them as well. So throw them into the chat. We'll love to help you build your cash and your GPP stacks, anything along those lines. And yeah, bring your questions to the chat. Make sure you like and subscribe, Football Diehards, and promote this. And we'll be back with you every week through the regular season and possibly even the playoffs, because playoff DFS has its own little entity of fun as well. All right, so before we get into some of these games, Michael Osborne, who we've had before, has a question in the chat. It's one that we talked about a couple of weeks ago before he got hurt, that this was a good either or. So we're back on that again, and Michael says, who to start, Justin Fields or Lamar Jackson? Both are coming in with a little bit of a shakiness to them. You know, you got to worry about Fields if that shoulder is right, and Jackson, just really overall inconsistent play as far as he's concerned this year. So who do you like on that one, Eric? Would you start, Fields or Jackson?
This is the type of situation that I don't want to find myself in. This is why I generally try to consolidate down to one kind of top 10 quarterback, by the time we get to the stretch run. I guess for me, it would probably boil down to Lamar Jackson. I mean, neither is a amazing situation. With Lamar Jackson, generally speaking, you know what you're getting, right? It's a tough matchup against the Broncos secondary, but a lot of his damage does come on the ground. Same thing can be said for Justin Fields, but I'm not sure how eager they're going to be to keep rushing him as much as they were, given that he's at least in his first game back from injury, and this is a season going nowhere, right? So if I was that coaching staff, I would certainly want to try to protect him a little bit for next season. Coaches do things that are not logical all the time, so we'll see. But ultimately, that's kind of the logic that would land me on Lamar.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I mean, at this time of year, it definitely pays to see who is actually playing for something right now and to see if they're going to really push that type of player. And the Ravens absolutely are, and the Bears absolutely aren't. They have no incentive to let Fields run wild like that, and they could kind of reel him in there. So I would agree that Lamar would be my choice there as well. All right. So thank you for that question. Keep them coming. And we are going to get right down to it, breaking down every single game. And we're going to start with one of the highest total ones on the week, which is probably, I mean, if you're looking at everything, you consider the game of the week. And that's the Chiefs-Bengals, which has currently an over-under of 52.5. Chiefs are 2.5-point road favorites in Cincinnati. This one has shootout potential written all over it. There's the Cincinnati side is looking to get a lot healthier with some really important players. It looks like Joe Mixon is going to come back, even though he's officially listed as questionable. It looks like Jamar Chase is also going to return from his long injury. Since week 7, I think he's been out. So it looks like Chase, we'll start with the Bengals here. It looks like Chase was very close to returning last week. So I'm under the impression that they just wanted to get him to be 100%. So when building lineups and building stacks, I'm operating under the notion that Chase is a full go tomorrow. So let's start with Cincinnati here, Eric. Who are you targeting in this game if you're doing it from a stacking perspective? And are there any standout cash plays to you here?
Yeah, it's going to be hard to say definitively until we get into that Sunday morning window. Obviously, I want exposure to this game and to the Bengals specifically. In terms of their pass catchers, I'll really be looking to go overweight on whichever of the two is rostered less. Right, right now that looks like it's Jamar Chase. It's a narrow margin, right, 9% to 7%. But basically, that's my plan heading in terms of the pass catchers. In terms of probably my favorite play for the Bengals, it is the aforementioned Joe Mixon. Technically still in the protocol, but he's working his way through the progression as you would hope, and as players who typically end up playing have this week. So like getting him into not only my stacks on this game, but also as, kind of a mini stack if I'm, building around different games. Ultimately in these type of shootout environments, we tend to see the pass catchers be the more popular options. So there's always leverage going to the running back, and Joe Mixon's in a really solid spot, right? The Chiefs have allowed the 12th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. They're allowing 4.5 yards per carry. And we know that this offense, yes, they have prolific pass catchers, but that is all built on the back of a solid run game and the play action that enables. So I expect a heavy dose of Joe Mixon in his first game back, and I like the leverage that he offers getting into this game.
Yeah, and I'll even throw a stat on top of the running back stats that you put there. Chiefs have also given up the second most receptions out of the backfield to running backs as well. So, Mixon, we thought he was going to be more involved since the beginning of last year in the passing game than he has been, but he's definitely not one that you can say, like, he's not a Nick Chubb where he's simply the running quarterback. He can be involved in the passing game. And I'll say, too, that, if for some reason he doesn't play, I'm okay going with Pirine there. I was afraid of him last week given the matchup against Tennessee, but he really performed well, and he had 21 touches and 80% snap rate. They trust him in the passing game. So if he goes, he's one of the top values there if Mixon does happen to be out. But it does look like Mixon is more likely than not to return against the Chiefs. From a cash perspective on this side, I'm going to stake my love for Joe Burrow. There are some cheaper quarterbacks right now that are kind of swirling around my pool for cash quarterbacks. But if you've got the money and you can get up to Burrow at 6,900, I think he's the best option in that upper range from a floor perspective there. With Chase back and with Mixon back, this offense is at full strength. The Chiefs have given up the ninth most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks, and they have the sixth lowest pressure rate in the NFL. So, finally that Cincinnati offensive line could come together and save Burrow some sacks there. So I love him from a floor ceiling perspective as my cash quarterback this week if I do have the money to get up to that. So on the Kansas City side, this looks like this is an interesting one too. The Chiefs have a team total of 27. We'll start with the passing game here because the running game has gotten a little bit more weird with them adding Melvin Gordon to their practice squad. But I mean, we'll start with Patrick Mahomes, who people were worried about with Tyreek Hill going. We've mentioned this before. Obviously, that worry was in vain. He looks like he is the clear favorite to be the MVP this year. He's on pace for career highs in some passing stats, which is amazing given the career he's had. So I think we can agree that Patrick Mahomes is playable in all formats. The question is, how are we approaching stacking with him? Because he is not a Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts type guy that you can run naked, as they say, without receivers. You've got to stack him with his passing options. So what's your approach here for a Mahomes stack in GPPs?
Yeah, it's going to be tricky, right? I think the best way to approach it is to try and overload stack. So one of the answers is clear. Travis Kelce is always going to be far and away the most likely player to lead his position in scoring week in and week out. I'm not going to expect that to change this week, right? So really the question is, who is the second player that you rotate in there? And I use the word rotate specifically because that's going to be the approach that I take, right? There isn't really a cornerback matchup 1-to-1 that is particularly favorable for any of the wide receivers in Kansas City, right? There are guys like Taylor Britt who allow a pretty solid catch rate, but do a pretty good job of wrapping up and not letting stuff get behind them. Don't look now, but Eli Apple is actually playing a lot better out of the slot as well. So there's not really a huge standout edge in terms of the matchup itself. So really, I'll be looking to rotate through just about all of his pass catchers, specifically in the context of overload stacking and using that as a strategy in GPPs. A lot of these value guys, these price probably offer some of the most interesting leverage, right? Justin Watson's sitting around 2% right now. Sky Moore's sitting around 2% right now. These are very much so dart throws, but to get some salary relief, which you'll need if you're starting with Kelce and Mahomes in your stack, and to get into this game in a sub 5% with a sub 5% player, these are things that you're going to have if you want to build around the most popular game of the week.
Yep, and a name that I've been sticking into some of these lineups is Noah Gray as well. Weird thing with him, and it kind of took me a while to catch on to his usage, but Gray last week played more snaps than Marquez Valdes-Scantling, Sky Moore, and Juju Smith-Schuster. I don't expect Juju will have the snap rate that he did last week, because they were easing him back in clearly. I do think we get a more full workload from him. But, this is the Chiefs running more two tight end sets with Kelce and Gray with every week as we go on along here. So I think that's a really good leverage spot to get off of Kelce, or even run them both too. If they both have the capability of scoring in this thing, and if you want to skip the wide receivers altogether, that's a good way to kind of build around that too. Now, what about the running game? So Isaiah Pacheco last week had 23 touches, and he even ran 15 routes in their win. So let's assume that Jerick McKinnon plays, and even that Melvin Gordon is active or whatever they want to do with that. Are you into Pacheco in this game against the Bengals?
I mean, really only from the leverage standpoint, right? I mentioned it with Mixon, highest game total on the board. People are going to be, trying to find ways to stack around this game. Usually that leaves the running backs kind of as a secondary thought. So I think that'll be the case. with Pacheco as it will be with Mixon. With Pacheco specifically, I mean, this backfield is such a mess, right? Like you mentioned him running, a dozen or so routes last week. He doesn't get a ton of usage as a pass catcher, right? So someone else, be it Jerick McKinnon or Melvin Gordon or Ronald Jones, is going to be in the mix and on the field for at least their third down and probably their hurry up work. So he's just got a lot of limiting factors to his upside. My plan is to probably try to come in underweight to the field on him. Right now, I see him about 6%. I'll probably want to be around that kind of 3 to 4 range, but really just rotating him in as a tertiary piece in case sort of the parallel universe outcome of this game plays out.
Yeah. I mean, he's a weird one. His price hasn't moved that much, which is intriguing. After last week's game, I guess the one thing that worries me about him the most is that against the Rams, they were double-digit favorites, so it was clear the game script was going to favor him there. This one could be, a lot more neutral throughout, so maybe they'll revert more to the pass. Kansas City is a lot more aggressive with passing on the road than they are at home notoriously, so that's one to look at too. But I mean, the price is right there, and you're right. That's if people stack this game, it's going to be Mahomes and company, not Pacheco. So I like it as a leverage play too. All right, so that is Chiefs and Bengals. I almost said Ravens. I think we've covered that one pretty well. So let's kind of move on here. This is the marquee one, but there are definitely some other ones from a fantasy perspective. And I feel like we're always talking about the Detroit Lions in that vein because, I mean, they've been fantasy and DFS gold all year. An offense that can score and a defense that can't stop people from scoring always is what you want to target in this one. So we've got the Jaguars, who look like they're coming on as an offense right now, going up against the Lions, who are giving up 28.2 points per game this year. In all the early articles that I've run out this week on both Fantasy Pros and on Football Diehards, I've had Trevor Lawrence as the value quarterback of the week, and one that I am putting in first as my cash quarterback, and then kind of messing around from there to see if I can go up or if I need to go down from him. Trevor Lawrence over the last 2 weeks has thrown for 5 touchdown passes and has thrown 77 passes, a passer rating of just under 120, and averaging just over 24 DraftKings points per game. So 5,900, I think that's a really, really nice value for cash. So you, who are a savvy stacker, if Lawrence is showing the ownership that we know that he is, how are you going to gain some leverage off that in the passing game?
Yeah, I mean, Lawrence absolutely should be most people's default for cash game quarterbacks. So tip of the cap to you for arriving at that as well. But, while that's the case, at least right now, I don't see him with the rostership that usually the de facto cash quarterback carries, right? I see him around 8% right now. So you don't have to go crazy to try to get different in your tournament builds that you're starting with Trevor Lawrence. For me in the tournament context, it's always going to be at least a 3-way stack with my primary quarterback. Christian Kirk, Zay Jones, both very solid plays in their own right. I'm not sure I want to play them together necessarily. Certainly can, but I think the way that the offense rolls isn't really conducive to those two both having plus performances. For me, a quick way to always get leverage off of a popular quarterback, pair him with his pass-catching running back. So ETN is going to be heavily featured, and then I'll probably rotate around both the aforementioned Kirk and Zay Jones. Also look to get a little bit of Marvin Jones in there. We've got the revenge narrative, which is always fun, right? But he's also going to be categorically less popular than Christian Kirk or Zay Jones, and still has a pretty sizable role in this offense in terms of his snap percentage, in terms of the routes that he runs, He gets a decent amount of looks when they're in scoring position. So, really, I like kind of building my foundation of leverage around Lawrence and ETN stacks, and then just rotating in across those three primary pass catchers.
So this is a segue to my next question here. Then, as a cash player, one of the biggest dilemmas that I'm going to face this week is how much I love both Trevor Lawrence and Travis Etienne. Especially since both I consider to. I mean, Lawrence, you could say he's maybe a tiny bit underpriced at 5,900 given how he's played. But, I mean, given his season-long thing, it's about right. He's the QB 11 on the season. His pricing is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10th highest. So he's right about there as far as his season average goes. ETN, on the other hand, is vastly underpriced at 6,400. Given the fact that it looks like he's a full go. They were just treating him with a little bit of caution last week because that's the same foot that cost them the year in his, I guess you'd call it his rookie season. So are you okay with playing both Lawrence and ETN in a cash setting, or is that kind of a thing more reserved for GPPs as maybe a pivot off a straight passing stack?
Yeah, it's more so the latter, right? Generally, I'm not looking to stack in cash, but for kind of like a mispricing situation. And while ETN offers really good points per dollar value, he's not quite at that misprice category, and it's contrarian enough to where you're going to have situations where ETN is able to generate points without Trevor Lawrence and vice versa, right? So, you're looking for that kind of Venn diagram overlap to really give you leverage on the field in a tournament, and you just don't need that in a cash setting. And they're working against each other for the majority of the time. So I probably wouldn't go to that pairing specifically in a cash context.
All right, so yeah, that's my biggest thing here. I would say, I know this seems like a bit of a wishy-washy answer, if you're asking, because we always have kind of cash cores, and that's the building blocks of cash lineups. I think if you're asking me what a cash core is from this game, I'll say it's one of them for sure. I think you need to have either one of Lawrence or ETN in your cash. I would start with ETN. If you really want to go with Lawrence, possibly think about pivoting off the running backs, because there are plenty of other options, both up and down at the running back position. But I would get a piece of that because Detroit has really been just a sieve for opposing offenses, and it really shouldn't change against this Jacksonville offense this week. Speaking of Detroit, they played the Bills very tough on Thanksgiving. They've had a lot of time to rest since then. They have a definite advantage of playing at home here in their domed environment. So we can start with the passing game here too. Amon-Ra St. Brown, once again, I find him to be far too cheap. Over the last 5 games, he's averaging 9.6 targets per game. The Jaguars is a soft defense. Again, they've given up the 9th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. Even a matchup against Buffalo didn't deter him from putting up big numbers. He is one of the top plays for me in cash as well. Where are you sitting on him as far as GPPs? Because we are going to be looking at some pretty heavy ownership on him at $7,100 on DraftKings. So I'm looking to see, he is currently the 2nd highest behind the guy we'll talk about soon. What's your take on the Detroit passing game as far as he goes?
Yeah, it certainly starts with Amon-Ra St. Brown. Looking at rostership projections at this point in the week, they need to be taken with a bit of a grain of sand. But ultimately, while I see him around 14% right now, I expect that number to go up, and I expect he'll finish as one of the 2 or 3 most popular options at receiver, and for good cause, right? We look at his matchup. He's going to see a fair amount of Williams in this game. Upwards of 80% of his snaps is going to be running up against Williams.
Mhm.
Williams is carrying a 52.2 pro PFF grade. He's allowing a little bit better than 1 yards per route covered. So, all the things that we like about St. Brown, the volume that he's going to carry, how many passes he's going to catch, his ability to potentially get schemed open or get a decent amount of yak. These are all things that are going to only be amplified by his matchup with Williams. And this is a game that I really like to shoot out, right? So Brown is checking a lot of boxes. Even if he's one of the more popular wide receivers on the week, I mean, if he's coming in sub 25% even, I think he's definitely still in the pool in a tournament context.
Yeah, sure. Why not? I mean, and that it's a good time as any to say that. Just remember that just because a player is highly rostered does not automatically exclude him from the GPP pool. It's just kind of a bit of context to see if is it worth it to be overweight or underweight on such a high rostership or something along those lines as well. So what about the rest of the Detroit offense here? I want to talk about the running backs real quick, but are there any other receivers on the Detroit side besides St. Brown that you'd be looking at in this one?
Yeah, I'll keep walking down Narrative Street. We have the rare double revenge game as DJ Shark returns, or at least makes his return in a matchup against his former team, the Jaguars. Shark has got a solid enough role in this offense, right? He's only been back on the field for 2 weeks, but when he's not being, slowly ramped up into the game, he's averaging better than 75% of snaps. He's running about 34 routes per game. Last week wasn't this prolific week in terms of volume. He saw 5 targets, hauled in 2 of them for 16 yards. Was just so happened that one of those was a touchdown. I do think that we'll see him as a decent kind of secondary option to pass catches in this offense. Narrative Street aside, a lot of the things I was saying about Amon-Ra St. Brown's favorable matchups also carry over to Chark, right? Actually, he's got secondary or cornerbacks that are giving up a higher percentage, a higher catch rate in their coverage. So, do like his opportunity to catch certainly more than 2 passes this week. But they like to use them in the red zone. It's an interesting way to get into this game, as Chark is going to be sitting around 5% or less in terms of his rostership. So I do think that he should be in the rotation for either mini stacks, or if you catch a wild hair and you want to stack the Detroit side of this, he's definitely a decent option for your second player in that overload.
Yeah. All right. So I like that too. And I'll say, he was very inefficient, but he has got that big play upside that you're looking for, that home run threat in these GPP contexts. So the one guy I want to talk about before we leave this game, who is fascinating to me, is DeAndre Swift, who was a punchline pretty much this past week. I found a funny meme of him myself and posted it on there and laughed at everybody else's too. But if we break it down here, he's off the injury report this week. He ran 14 routes last game against the Bills, and he had 8 targets. The Jaguars have given up the 4th most receptions to opposing running backs, and Swift is 5,600. To me, I am loading up on him in GPPs this week, and I'm curious to see if you're the same.
Yeah, I've got exactly the same thought. I mean, I've been saying for a few weeks now, there's going to be a week where DeAndre Swift is going to break the slate. This very much so sets up to be that type of week, at least based on circumstance alone. But to kind of the broader point, to load up on DeAndre Swift is like 10 to 12% exposure in your pool, right? He's still not going to be a very popular option. You can be 3x the field on him and only have him in 1 out of 7 lineups. So
Yep.
that it presents a really interesting opportunity. The biggest news, the biggest thing that's changed his circumstance is the price tag, right? This thing has absolutely hit rock bottom. I mean, even if he's only going to see a third of snaps as he has been for the last 3 weeks, if he's catching just a handful of passes, he's got a really clear path to paying off that price tag. And, for however maddening it is the way that the Lions use him, he's still one of the more dynamic athletes with the ball in his hand across the entire NFL. So, all of these things are just, it's just a dream scenario for a tournament.
It is. This looks like one of the weeks that just aligns everything for the Swift breakout. So, hopefully we're ahead of the field on this because, we seem to be in lockstep on that. I'm gonna put the money down, where our mouths are, if you will, on Swift this week for sure. So, all right. So that is Jacksonville, Detroit. Those are the two, I think, most popular ones here. So we're going to go, we got the next 10 to go through over the course of the next, half hour, 35 minutes or so, which we'll get to. We do have a couple of questions in the chat that I want to address real quick for our listeners. Thank you for these. YTSCELO says, Devin Singletary or James Conner for the playoffs. So this is an interesting one here. I'm not really sure. I guess this is an in general throughout the next few weeks because Singletary has already played for the week and Conner won't play since he's on a bye for this week in particular. So I guess looking ahead, is there one of these two guys that you like better than the others? For me, it's easily Conner, given his role the last couple of weeks. He's got almost a 90% opportunity share for the Cardinals. What about you?
Yeah, volume is king in this game, right? I think the basis of the question has to do with the Cardinals' schedule. They have, apart from their January 1st game, which would be the fantasy championship, they have a murderer's row of opposing defenses. Patriots, Broncos, Buccaneers, then they have the Falcons. They close out with the 49ers. So it's a very tough stretch for the Cardinals, but ultimately he is going to outtouch Devin Singletary by an order of magnitude that you just can't pass up on. And now, the groundswell of attention and breakout potential for James Cook really feels like it's kind of starting to swell over now. So we're not even talking about a known quantity with Singletary's role, right? I think we're going to see him continue to cede some work to James Cook as the weeks go on. So I'll go Conner as well, but it might not be some of his best weeks down the stretch run.
Yeah, I think you put it perfectly there, that it's the predictability of volume there, especially with what Cook just did yesterday against the Patriots. All right, so thank you for that. We got a couple of questions from Mike K. We'll kind of maybe take them one at a time, get back to DFS, and then go back to him. So first one there is, Mark Andrews going to do anything this week, or should I pick up Dalton S? I guess that's Dalton Schultz for the playoffs. If you've got Andrews, you're rolling Andrews here. He still got 7 targets last week. I understand that, it seems to have been quite a drastic fall off. I do like Schultz for sure. So, if you've got a spot, I don't advocate 2 tight ends, but if you've got a spot to hold him there, sure. But if you have Andrews and you don't really have a player to drop for Schultz, I probably wouldn't do it, because that would essentially mean you're dropping Andrews, which you're definitely not doing. So I would say hold unless you have a spot. You agree?
Yeah, I think that's the bigger point, right? You're not going to be starting Dalton Schultz over Mark Andrews, but we're deep enough in the season where there is something to be said for playing keep away with a player that has top 5. He was a tight end 1 last week, right? So technically, top 1 upside, and keeping them away. I've got teams that have already made the playoffs where I'm trotting out Trey McBride or hoping Daniel Bellinger makes their way back, right? So keeping that type of asset away from your opponents also has some intrinsic value, but ultimately you'd start Andrews every time that they're both available.
Yeah. I think we're in agreement there. All right, so thank you for that. We'll get back to your other ones in a second. We're going to get to Chargers Raiders right now, which is actually the third highest total. We're looking at a 50.5. We got 3 games over 50 points this week, so we could be looking at some high scoring stuff from a DFS perspective this week. So the Chargers look to be in a fun spot here. They have ruled out Mike Williams again, so. Some stats on some of the existing players here. Austin Eckler has averaged shade under 20 touches and 104 yards per game over their last 8 with 12 touchdowns. He's my RB1 again this week. I think just given his role in the passing game against the Raiders, who have given up the most receiving yards to running backs this season, 8,500 honestly feels cheap to me. I'm certainly not saying that a player of that price is a lock, but he is definitely my top running back this week on a week where there are some really, really good top running backs around him. What about the passing game for you with Mike Williams out? Are you interested in Keenan Allen again? Are you more interested in Josh Palmer from a price perspective? Over the last 4 games, Palmer has played 91% of snaps, and he's averaging almost 10 targets per game. So what's your go-to here for the receivers? And I'll throw in Everett with that too.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to like with this Chargers receiving core. And if it needs to be stated, probably doesn't, but I'll say it anyways. Austin Eckler is a big part of that receiving core. Keenan Allen he's in a decent enough spot, right? The matchup is certainly favorable. His price tag is very reasonable. He should see pretty decent volume. Feels a bit more like a cash play to me. Interesting leverage on him because I think most people are going to end up spending up at wide receiver. So getting into that kind of mid 6K range, gets you a little bit different. But the player that really jumps out for me is the one you mentioned, Josh Palmer. Everyone is either going to go to Keenan Allen or they're going to go to Austin Eckler or they're going to go chase DeAndre Carter's points last week. And here's Josh Palmer, who's absolutely, at least in terms of the way that they use him, filling in the role of Mike Williams in this offense, right? Over his last 5 games, snap share of 90% or higher, including 97% last week. He's running, 40s, even into the 50s of routes. He's seeing a heap of targets every single week. Not necessarily catching all of them, because a lot of them are a little bit further downfield, but seeing a good amount of air yards. I mean, all of the potential that you're looking for a big splashy player is right there with Palmer, and he's probably going to be their 3rd most rostered pass catcher, maybe 2nd, depending on how this breaks as we get closer to Sunday. He's someone that I'm intending to be well overweight to the field on, and I'm really looking to attack this game in general.
Yeah, and just from a DFS perspective, his price really doesn't do him justice. I mean, with that kind of volume and snap share, he's still only $5,600. I mean, he's less than Jerry Jeudy, who has given no reason. That's the whole Denver offense's fault. He's less than Jerry Jeudy. He's given no reason to be over Josh Palmer this year. Some other players that are just a little bit more, even Brandon Ayuk has been better than I thought he was going to be, but he's been inconsistent with the targets. I don't think his price fits his role here. So I'm with you on that one. Now on the Raiders side, Josh Jacobs is one of the most polarizing plays to me this week. He's coming off 300 yards or 300 all-purpose yards there, even more, I think, there. He's 7,900. Given the fact that he is an elite RB1, over 300. He had 303 all-purpose yards, and then obviously that long touchdown the end of overtime. Now, he aggravated a calf injury in that game, speculating that it was on that 86-yard run. So he's practiced in a limited fashion all week. Now, if he does play, he's facing a Chargers team that has allowed 5.7 yards per carry and 14 touchdowns to running backs, and the third most fantasy points per game. Given the fact that over his last 8 games, Jacobs is averaging 26 touches per game, I think you can make the argument that he is the RB1 for this week. However, this is a late game, so your rosters might be set, and you won't have too much pivoting by the time he kicks off. How are you treating Jacobs this week? And I'll throw an even bigger wrinkle at you that he is currently our highest projected rostered running back in DFS. So how are we playing Josh Jacobs this week?
So I'll put my tinfoil hat on and say that I don't believe that Josh Jacobs will end up being the highest rostered running back when it's all said and done. Not based on merit, right? I mean, all of the points that you made arguing for him are rock solid, right? I feel like we've spent weeks and weeks talking about how Josh Jacobs is underpriced unless he's north of 8,500. So he's an absolutely stellar play, but that questionable flag in DraftKings next to a player's name who's in the late slate of games seems like it always drags down rostership, right? So if that's the case, I'm looking to get overweight on Josh Jacobs as well, right? I see him around 21% right now. If that slides down to kind of the mid to low teens, I probably want to have about 21% exposure to him, sort of about 50% more than the field. He's in an absolutely stellar spot. I don't think that not only the team is going to risk him, pushing him with a workload that he can't handle, but I also don't think that he's going to push to, go out there and, take on a starting workload if he's not healthy enough to do so, right? He's playing in a contract year. So you kind of have these aligned interests to where, neither party is really going to be pushing him to be out there if he's not. And, looking at the slate of games, there are a lot of very interesting running back pivots in that late window, right? So, if you have Jacobs in there and he ends up being scratched, you can get over to a Mixon. You can get over to the running back on the other side of the field, Austin Eckler, right? So I think it's a relatively low-risk proposition to wait out the news for the late slate of games. And if he's in there and he's playing, you have, a well under-rostered player that can, again, potentially lead the slate in scoring.
Yep. And McCaffrey is in the late window, and so is Kenneth Walker, too. So, you do definitely have options. So, yeah, that's going to be a fun one to play as we go along here. Just real quick also on the Raiders, we got a couple more questions in here to get to. Real quick on the Raiders, Devontae Adams over the last 4 games is averaging 13.8 targets per game, and he has 5 touchdowns. So he can be played in anything that you can fit him in, with Renfrow and Waller both on IR. And I like Foster Moreau again as a cheap tight end. One of the ones he's perpetually in that mid $3,500 range there. The fact that he played a 97% snap share, that is all I need from a tight end of that price tag for cash. So, all right. We have a question in here. I think we can take a minute to get to this one from John Logalbo, who says, because this is a DFS related question, I've been a FanDuel cash game player for a long time, making the switch to DraftKings. Do you have any advice regarding differences in cash game strategy in moving from one site to the other? So, there's a few off the top of my head. The ones, just knowing the difference in how much more dynamic the pricing is on DraftKings is useful there. FanDuel is such a looser pricing site that you can pay up for the top defense at 5,000. They cap their defense over on FanDuel at 5,000. So you can pay up for the defense without worrying about it over there. You don't have to punt like you really do on DraftKings. Quarterback is the same way. Every dollar is precious on DraftKings that you want to. I'm not saying you don't pay up for quarterback, because you can, but you're looking for those savings there so you can fill in the skill player, because it is full PPR. as opposed to half PPR. DraftKings also has the bonuses on it, so you're looking to roster those like high expectation players, like 100 yards, 100 yards rushing, 100 yards receiving, 300 yards passing. So there's that as well. So it's really kind of, looking for those high volume cheap plays, since it is full PPR, I think that is going to let you get those elite things. Is there anything that I missed in there? I mean, that's kind of off the top of my head, but is there anything I missed that you can think of with a difference from FanDuel to DraftKings?
That feels pretty comprehensive. I don't play a ton of cash games, so this could be a misnomer on my behalf. It would almost seem to me like FanDuel is a more favorable ground for playing cash games, right? Because without the bonuses, for example, there's you're exposed to less variance. The pricing categorically is softer on FanDuel, so you can really get up to any and usually every play that you want to get to. So you've got a bit more agency in how you put your roster together, and those are things that I would look for in a cash setting. But I might be kind of projecting my my side gig as a cash game player onto FanDuel.
Yeah, we're kind of like the yin and yang on this show, where we do both play both contests, but the pendulum definitely shifts here. So yeah, so thanks for that question. I'm glad we get some general strategy DF questions in there as well. But we are going to get back to the slate. Keep them coming here. Miami and San Francisco. This one looks like it could go multiple ways. It's a 47-point total. I honestly like the over on this one. I don't. I think Kyle Shanahan and Mike McDaniel are offensive minded enough that they're going to put up points in this game. I know both teams are strong defensively, but I think that total is too low. And I think this game can be stacked all over the place in multiple different ways from a DFS perspective. The problem I'm having here is if you're going like Tua, Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle with McCaffrey on the way back, or even Deebo Samuel on the way back, that's a lot of money. So I'll kind of turn this over to you as more of the GPP first player. What are some ways you're approaching this game?
Yeah, so we are diametrically opposed in terms of how we think about this game, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? I think this game kind of shades towards the under, more to do with the trenches than anything else. We've already got um, uh, Austin Jackson ruled out for Miami. It looks like Armstead is potentially in question as well, and we have the return of some key defensive players for San Francisco. I think this one becomes a bit more of a dogfight than it does a shootout. So I'm not looking to necessarily stack this one or go overweight in the tournament context, but there are several plays that are very strong on merit alone, right? Um, you know, Christian McCaffrey sitting at 8.6K, he should be all systems go in terms of having potentially his highest workload in San Francisco since he's arrived there. So to get him at sub 9K when that's the case is always going to be interesting. I like Brandon Ayuk's price tag at 6.1K. He's kind of in a no man's land um, from a pricing standpoint, and I'm a bit concerned about Deebo Samuel, not only his availability but the way that they'll use him if he is available. So I like getting over to Brandon Ayuk as a way to kind of de-risk myself from that. The far and away best from the game, in my estimation, is George Kittle. $5,000 flat. People generally don't draw as much rostership when they're an even price point as it is, and he is heavily involved in this passing game. It feels like the addition of Christian McCaffrey has really kind of unlocked the ways in which they use him. So, to get what is sort of that upper echelon of tight end production out of a guy that is thousands of dollars less than a Travis Kelce or a Mark Andrews, that's the one that really jumps off the page for me.
He's for sure my favorite 49ers pass catcher in this game as well. So I'm glad you said that. Dolphins have given up the third most fantasy points per game to tight ends. They have not been able to stop that position all season, and he's a dynamic pass catcher. Real quick before we go off this game and go to the next one, the running games in this one. So, McCaffrey, you mentioned, we don't have Elijah Mitchell. McCaffrey is dealing with some tendonitis in his knee. I'm not too concerned about how that affects him in this game, which is a big one. What about the Miami side? Raheem Mostert looks like he's going to be back. So that kind of takes the rails off of Jeff Wilson a little bit, especially San Francisco's given up the fewest fantasy points per game to running backs. You're not interested in the Miami running game on that side, I assume?
Not really, right? In a vacuum, I am not. Is probably the better way to put it. If I'm looking to get into this game and stack it, which, like I said, there's a merited argument to be made for it. I do like Mostert as a leverage play. Everyone really from the moment that the trade of Jeff Wilson was announced was up in arms and fanfare for how this is now Jeff Wilson's backfield, and I think Mostert has a pretty considerable role to play, right? So. Like him as kind of a punching option to get different into this game, but I'm not going to have him in a whole lot of my rotations.
Yeah, I would tend to think the same thing. So it's a fascinating one, really, and we'll kind of see where we land. Like you said, being opposed on the style of games that we're expecting here. All right, so next one we got is Packers and Bills. I've been back and forth on how interested I am in this, so I'll give the cash play that I'm looking at right off the bat. If you were looking to save for a cheap volume wide receiver, I think Chase Claypool is really interesting this week at under 4,000. Darnell Mooney's done for the season. Claypool had a 75% route participation share last week against the Jets, which was his highest since joining the Bears. He had Sauce Gardner on him a good amount. So I know this isn't the best matchup against Green Bay, but right now it looks like anything is better than Gardner covering you. So 3,800, I think, with Fields looking like he's back, is a good play for cash. I don't think he's going to kill you at 3,800, and I think he's got enough that he could actually help you. So that's really all I'm looking at in this game from a cash perspective. What about GPP for you?
Yeah, I might have some kind of mini stack run back interest in this game. There are a lot of guys that offer pretty solid points per dollar return, but also carry a decent amount of upside. I mean, starting with Christian Watson, right? 5.2K. I think that he's shown us enough both in his on-field production, but also the way that they use him in this offense to merit a larger or higher price tag. And I mean, with the streak that he's on, he's got 5 touchdowns in his last 3 games.
Six.
The upside is 6. Yeah, the upside is absolutely there, right? I guess the concern for Christian Watson is just how capable that injured hand or that injured thumb of Aaron Rodgers is. So that potentially introduces some risk, but to get a 5K player that can easily vault into a wide receiver 1 production and has been doing it for the last handful of weeks is going to be interesting to me. I think Aaron Jones is underpriced. As much as I want to get over to Justin Fields, I am concerned about his usage and whether or not they're going to run him as they had been over the last month or so. So I'm probably not going to get a whole lot of Fields exposure, but in terms of kind of rounding out my tournament builds, if I'm looking for relatively inexpensive correlated run back with in a game that is on kind of the top half of the scoring projections, there's a lot of pieces that I like in this one.
Yeah, and for Christian Watson, he, over the last 3 weeks, is the wide receiver 2 in the NFL, behind only Devontae Adams. So a little bit wacky with the price tag, given that. I'm not saying he should be up in the 7K range, but I'm not saying he should be $5,200 either. So I like that call.
Yeah.
All right, so moving on, we have the Jets and the Vikings. The aforementioned Sauce Gardner resides here, and he will be covering Justin Jefferson almost certainly. So actually, let's start there because there's a couple of Jet plays I want to talk about, but let's start right there. Over the last 3 games, Sauce Gardner, has the primary receiver he's been covering was Stephon Diggs, who went for 5 catches for 93 yards, Jacoby Myers, who went for 452, and Claypool, who I just mentioned, who had 2 catches for 51 yards. No touchdowns at all. So Jefferson, somebody that you can always have in your GPP pool given his talent. Is he someone that you're looking to roster this week? I am on the no side just because of some other upper-end wide receivers that I like a whole lot more. Devontae Adams, Tyreek Hill, I just mentioned, Chase. So I'm probably not going to have any Jefferson. But what about you?
So I am on the not right now side. As we've talked about ad nauseum, right? Rostership projections evolve over the course of the days leading up to lineup lock. So, based on where he's sitting right now, kind of around that 8 to 10% range, I probably won't have very much of him, if any. The broader point that is kind of drawing me away from him is exactly the one that you laid out. He is very expensive, and there are a couple of other top tier wide receivers from a pricing standpoint that I would rather. But I'm not overly concerned about his matchup this week. Obviously, Sauce Gardner is playing probably better than anybody expected as a rookie, but Justin Jefferson shouldn't see a whole lot of Sauce. Sauce isn't really shadowing a lot this year. He's running more than 80% of his snaps from the defensive left side, right? Usually when you see a player shadowing, they're bouncing around far more often. So I don't think it's going to be like a lockdown situation with Jefferson. And if we get to Sunday morning and he's in that kind of 3 to 5% range, then I would be interested in getting a few shares of him in the mix.
What about Adam Thielen? His price is all the way down to 5,000. He's predictably regressing as he should, given his age and whatnot, and being the wide receiver 2 or even the wide receiver 3 now on that team since they've acquired Hawkinson. 5,000 though. I mean, you got to give that at least a look, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is a true blue pricing play, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I mentioned, the Jets generally haven't been shadowing much this year, so you don't have to worry about him just being completely removed from the game. And at 5K to get a guy that is running routes in the mid to high 30s, pushing 50, high 40s in games that are shooting out, his path to value there is super clear.
Yeah, I agree. So the Jet side, I'll start with the cash, and I'm very curious as to your GPP take on this guy. But, I mentioned that I made the mistake. I had Garrett Wilson all week in my lineup and then pivoted half hour before kickoff, pivoted him out, pivoted Michael Carter in. Carter went down. Wilson went off. The rest is a loss for me. So looking back on Garrett Wilson, his price is only up $300 from last week. Is at $5,200. In the 4 games this year where Zach Wilson wasn't the quarterback, Wilson averaged 10.25 targets per game and 6 catches per game. He's also averaging 19.4 PPR points per game without Zach Wilson as opposed to 8.3 with him. So he was obviously Mike White's go-to guy. He had 8 targets, 5 catches, 95 yards, 2 scores last week. He is 100% the first player I'm entering into cash this week. Looking at the early rostership projections, it looks like I'm not the only one. So this is going to be another one of these questions. How are you treating this as a tournament play?
Yeah, I think you're spot on with your cash prospectus. Um, Wilson will absolutely be in the player pool. I'll probably be a little underweight. I see him, around 12% right now. It's just the price tag, right? Like he really shouldn't be in this kind of low 5K range given his role in the offense. The hesitation that you're hearing in my voice from a tournament perspective is I'm not ready to call Mike White the next coming quite yet, right? We saw last year he had that crazy breakout game against Cincinnati, and over the course of the next two games, he proceeded to complete like less than 60% of his passes, and I think he had 4 interceptions to 1 touchdown, right? So these are things that are a limiting factor to Garrett Wilson's upside. But upside is not really what you're shooting for in cash. So in a tournament, I'll have him rotating around again, especially if Justin Jefferson ends up with low ownership, and I'm trying to get into this game and look for a run back. Garrett Wilson will be the de facto choice for me on the Jet side.
Right, yeah. I would think that's the case there. Are you at all? Michael Carter's looking doubtful. So, real quick, are you at all interested in Zonovan Knight at 4,600? I think let's assume James Robinson is active. What are you doing with Knight? I think at 4,600 you can definitely throw him into tournaments. Is he someone that you think is like an extreme value at that tag, or is there just too much Ty Johnson and maybe even James Robinson involved for you to consider them?
Yeah, it's more the latter for me, right? It's really hard to project future performance when you're looking at a game scenario that involved an in-game injury from the week prior, right? Had the Jets headed into that game last week knowing they were without Michael Carter, they would have approached their running back and their running game entirely differently, right? Credit to Bam Knight, like he got up over 100 total yards. He looked pretty solid out there, but he did so on 50% of snaps. I'm expecting James Robinson to be activated for Sunday's game. So, now we're looking at a situation where I don't think anybody gets north of 40 to 45% of snaps. So 4.6K is plenty cheap. There's a lot of ways that he can get there, but I don't think that a three-headed, at least a back in a three-headed backfield is someone that's going to give the tournament upside I'm looking for.
Yeah, and I think at the very least, there's so much unpredictability there, but I think at the very least we can accurately predict, even though that Knight did get 3 targets and caught them all, we can absolutely bank on the fact that Johnson is the passing back there. So, you're getting maybe a split with 3 men in the running game, and he's not going to be heavily involved in the passing. I think it's something that you can avoid in DFS. All right, so yeah, I'm glad we said that too. Let's take a couple of questions. We got about 10, 15 minutes left. I want to try and kind of go rapid fire through the rest of the games we got here. But I'm going to take a question here, which will kind of segue us into our next game, which is Cleveland-Houston. Big news there is Deshaun Watson returning after 2 full years out of the league. So Mike K has a question. Should I start Hubert, which I assume is Justin Herbert, or Watson this week? Why don't we answer this one first, and then we'll kind of get into the game. I understand if you've picked up Watson or if you've stashed him for a while, that he has top 5 upside as a quarterback. There are definitely certain quarterbacks that I'm not starting him over, though, and Justin Herbert is one of those quarterbacks, especially in this week with the matchup we detailed against the Raiders. So that's a pretty easy call for me. There are definitely some other quarterbacks that it would give me a lot of pause. I do have a league where I have him and Geno Smith, and that is giving me real trouble, especially with Aaron Donald out. So, hey, what do you think? First of all, let's answer Mike's question, too. I say Herbert. What about you? Herbert over Watson?
Yeah, It's absolutely Herbert, and consider yourself fortunate, right? You have the benefit of time. You can continue to start Herbert and see how
Mhm.
this unfolds with Watson. If he gets back to the Watson of 2020 and prior, then you now have some incremental upside at your quarterback position. So I would wait to see it before I'm benching Herbert for Watson.
Absolutely. How about my question? Gino or Watson? Remember, Aaron Donald's out. Jalen Ramsey
Oh
sucks all this.
man. So
Yeah.
I am admittedly taking a very conservative line with Deshaun Watson, um, both because I think 2 years of rust is a lot to shake off, but also, I mean, this game script is one where I think that they'll be able to get a pretty quick lead on the Texans, and there is not a matchup that you would rather have Nick Chubb salt away a lead with than the one that he'll face against the Texans, right? So, a little bit of rust, a game script where they're not going to need Deshaun Watson to do much in order to win this game. Those are all mitigating factors that have him pretty well down my board in QB rankings, including behind Geno Smith.
All right. I had Gino in right now, too, but I need some validation on that. So when
Yeah.
Watson throws up 30, I can at least say that I had the right process. So, all right. So let's segue into that. You mentioned Chubb. He's 8,000. And the interesting thing there is he is priced right in lockstep with Josh Jacobs, who we already mentioned, and Derrick Henry, who we have yet to mention, who is also a volume-based king as far as running back goes. But you mentioned that matchup against Houston, plus the game script. Houston has given up the most fantasy points per game, 5 yards per carry, 15 rushing touchdowns. Everything sets up for Chubb to have top 3 or even top 1 upside as a running back this week. The one thing with him that you always worry about is the fact that he's not involved in the passing game. Is that still enough for you to pay $8K for him in both cash or GPP?
Yes, it is. I mean, you drew the comps to Derrick Henry, and I think that's the right way to be thinking about it. Like,
Mhm.
can he potentially get stifled? Can he, maybe be kept out of the end zone? Sure, but we've seen a large enough sample of him, getting to the return that you need, despite not being involved in the passing game, to where you have to take advantage of matchups like this. And 8K is a price tag that I think will pretty comfortably pay off in week 13.
Okay, so let me put you on the spot here then. Let's say you got your last spot to fill in a DFS lineup, and you have $8,100, which means you can afford all 3 of those guys that we talked about. Who would you plug in there? Asking for a
I'm
friend.
I'm probably going to Josh Jacobs. The thing that's sort of up in the air right now, I see Chubb with rostership around 14%. I think we actually see Jacobs end up closer to that point when it's all said and done this week. As long as that projection comes to pass, I would certainly lean on the Jacobs side.
Jacobs is actually my pick there too, and I'm very interested in that to see how that's going to shake out because Chubb and Henry both have very big spots as well. I mean, Henry, you could see, it's a tough one against the Eagles, but they're a lot tougher against the pass. We'll get to that in a second, but they're a lot tougher against the pass than they are against the run, and Henry is just matchup proof at this point. So real quick again on the Browns, I just want to throw in again from a cash perspective, and I don't know, maybe this is a GPP play for you as well, but David Njoku is out, and Harrison Bryant is the tight end 1. He's $2,700. I don't really need any more than that to play him as my cash tight end, especially in a favorable matchup against the Texans with seemingly an upgraded quarterback. So, I mean, I'm not going to say that I'm just locking him in and forgetting it because there are some other cheap tight ends, but $2,700 for a starting tight end with a team with a 27-point total does a lot for your lineups. Very quickly from you, what about the wide receivers here? If we say it's a quarterback upgrade, that obviously applies to them too. How are you treating Amari Cooper and Donovan Peoples-Jones in this one?
Yeah, they're players that I'm probably going to try to avoid. The game script point that I made with regard to Watson also holds true for them. there's also the open question as to whether or not Watson is back up to game speed immediately. So that's just enough risk and uncertainty to have me move away from the wide receivers for Cleveland.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I mean, uncertainty is not my friend, and I mean, I'm such a cash player too, though. Uncertainty is really not something that I tend to subscribe to in the DFS. I definitely understand if you're mixed multi-entering and you want to take some shots on Watson being all immediately back to what he was, go for it. But this is not really where I'm looking to spend my 2 or 3 entries in this week. I'll take one of the other games there. On the Houston side, Nico Collins had 9 targets last week, and Brandon Cooks is out. So I definitely think he's in play for all formats in this one as well. What about Pierce, real quick? You like him in any format this week? He's down below 6,000 after a couple of duds.
Yeah, Nico Collins is definitely in play, 4.2K. Pierce is interesting leverage, right? To your point, if you're throwing a dart that we're going to see Watson, come back to form immediately in this game, flirts with or even goes over its total, then Dameon Pierce is an interesting way to get on the Texans side, right? We talk about how favorable this Texans matchup is. Cleveland's right there with them, right? They've allowed almost the same amount of fantasy points to running backs. They're both right around 5.1, 5.2 yards per carry. Nobody is going to be on Dameon Pierce because he's kind of wet the bed over the last few weeks. So if you're in this game, Dameon Pierce is an interesting way to do it.
Yeah, and 5,900. That's the cheapest he's been since week 4 when he was 5,600 against the Chargers, and he put up 29.8 or 28.9 fantasy points in that game. So I like that a lot. All right, moving on. We got 5 or so minutes to go. We'll try and go a little bit fast here just to get some of the last plays. So Tennessee, Philadelphia. We mentioned Derrick Henry. Anybody else from this game you're approaching from a DFS perspective?
Yeah, I mean, Jalen Hurts will continue to be in the conversation for cash week in and week out, right? I think there are probably better options this week, but super safe with that rushing floor. AJ Brown in his own revenge game, he's in a prime position to take advantage of a secondary that has its holes. So the game itself isn't super interesting to me, so I'm not going to have many shares of these guys, but there are players, namely the ones I touched on, that at least have a merited argument for why they're a decent enough play.
Yeah, I like the AJ Brown call too there, and Tennessee's getting up the 3rd most touchdowns to wide receivers as well. So I think this is a really good spot for him to make one of those splashes that we were seeing early on in the season when he put 28 up in that week 1 against Detroit, and then followed it up with with a couple more scores. He had a 3-score game against Pittsburgh. I mean, we could see something along those lines here. Pittsburgh, Atlanta. Unfortunately, it looked like we were going to get a value game out of Jaylen Warren as the lead back, but Najee Harris is coming into this game with no injury designation, so it looks like the Jaylen Warren value is out. I am pretty much hard passing on this game, except for possibly the Pittsburgh defense as the cheap option at 2,600. Anybody that you like on either side?
Yeah, I mean, for me, Pat Freiermuth is probably one of, if not my maybe second most favorite tight end play this week. When they traded Chase Claypool, they said that they were going to get him the ball more, and they've done just that. He's averaging almost 8 targets a game in those 3 since Claypool left. So, to get him at 4.3K is good with me. I mean, Najee Harris, if you want to talk about a player that has a ton of leverage on the field in a really good spot, he's an interesting way to get different. Only in situations where I've eaten a lot of chalk, but that happens more often than I would like to admit in my tournament build. So might have a sprinkle or 2 of Harris out there as well.
All right, so Seattle Rams here. and then we'll kind of take a question here before we wrap it up here. So, um, we talked about Geno Smith in my dilemma here, and part of the reason that I'm kind of good with sticking with him is he is leading the NFL in completion percentage and is second in passer rating, fifth in yards per attempt. It's unbelievable what he has done this year. I've been waiting for it to fall off, and it just hasn't done it. He's the QB7 overall. I was a little bit wary of this matchup, but I mentioned that Aaron Donald is out, which is huge for the offense facing the Rams. And Jalen Ramsey has been bad. All of a sudden, it looks like he's just fallen apart. So there's really nobody on the Rams now that are giving any kind of fear to this offense. So, I mean, I'm kind of okay with. I don't know if I'm stacking them, but I'm kind of okay playing Geno Smith with one or two of their receivers there. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a fine play, right? From a pricing standpoint, from an efficacy standpoint, super solid. It's really more just about whether or not I want to get into this game, and the answer is emphatically no, right? Looks like we're going to see John Wolford this week, who is not going to be an upgrade, which is a very hard thing to do relative to how the Rams played last week. And, I think this is going to be a real kind of ham and egger, get up by a touchdown, maybe even a field goal, and just kind of salt this one away, because the Rams have clearly folded up shop for the season.
Yeah, they're in bad shape. I mean, they don't have their first rounder. That the Detroit's picking for them very early on. It looks like there. That was I get it. You sold out for a Super Bowl and you won the Super Bowl, so it's not like you can say it was a bad thing. But
fly forever.
Yeah, they're feeling it now, though. So the last play in this game, and then I want to talk about, and then we'll get to our question in the chat, and then we'll wrap it up. Kenneth Walker. So if we're looking here, he's been a revelation as a rookie back. 7,000 is still really too cheap for the way he's played. Rostership is showing that he's looking like he is the 7th highest rostered running back, ahead of Dalvin Cook, ahead of Saquon Barkley, ahead of Aaron Jones, who you mentioned, ahead of Pierce, who we both said, both Detroit running backs, Pacheco. He's ahead of all those in rostership. The last 2 games, he's rushed 24 times for 43 yards, which is 1.8 yards per carry. He did, however, kind of like amend his box scores with either touchdowns or just random involvement in the passing game that you really can't bank on here. So, he scored twice last week, short yardage touchdowns, which gave him 16.9 DraftKings points. The game before that against Tampa Bay, he rushed 10 times for 17 yards, but he had those 6 catches for 55, which again saved his box score. So I had him in cash, then deep dove into that and decided to go away from him. Is he a GPP play?
Not really. I mean, not at 12% rostership,
Yeah, right.
The last handful of weeks for him have really been pretty touchdown dependent, right? You remove that Arizona game, and 3 out of his last 4 is a better way to put it. If he's not finding the box, he's turning in a pretty sad effort. And for him to be sitting at 12%, there are just a lot of other places I would rather go. If this falls coming into Sunday, I do think he's got a game script working in his favor. So, we're in kind of like the mid single digit rostership, and maybe it piques my interest again. But at 7K, really needing to get a touchdown to get to value, at least over these last handful of weeks, there are just better options out there.
Yeah, it's scary when they become touchdown dependent, especially when it's an inefficient touchdown run dependent. All right, I think we're in agreement there. So that is going to about do it for us. We do have 2 more questions in the chat that I think we can end with. One is another one from Mike K, who says, "Should I drop Fournette? Is he done?" No, you're not dropping Fournette. I know that Rashad White is the shiny new toy, but you're definitely not dropping Fournette, especially with the Bucs in a playoff hunt. If they were tanking, that might be a different story, but they're not. All right, and then the last one here from Adam Weber. He says, I need the most upside in a must-win situation. Start 2 full PPR. We've got the aforementioned Rashad White, Kareem Hunt, Mac Hollins, and Jeff Wilson. Okay, that's a tougher one. So we need upside in a must-win situation there. What are you thinking on that one? I have to take
Pass.
Hunt out. God. I have to take Hunt out. Where are you going? What are your two, though?
Yeah, Hunt definitely is removed. Man, I've got Jeff Wilson in the 50s this week. Honestly, it might be Mac Hollins. He's in a decent enough spot from a matchup standpoint. Obviously, from a game flow standpoint, right? This is a game that's up over 50 points. So I think I would probably put Mac in there. The issue is that his floor is 0, right? But he's shooting for upside. So I would probably go Mac and Jeff Wilson of that lot.
I'm going to say I agree with you. I think Mac Hollins is the best option there. I mean, like you said, he does not have a floor. He's a distant wide receiver to Devontae Adams, but he is playing 97% of snaps for them. If he's a guy on the field, every play in that game is enough for upside there. I'm going to take White as the other one. Even if Fournette is back, I think he's involved enough in the passing game for full PPR to merit playing there. So we've got Hollins, Wilson from Eric, Hollins, White from me. Hunt is definitely removed as someone who is not involved enough in the offense. Even in a good matchup, which is too bad because it looks like he should be the top option there with the matchup they got coming. All right, so that is going to do it for our show today. We didn't quite get to every game. We've got our last round of bye weeks coming up next week in week 14, which is going to be tricky because that's going to be the fantasy playoffs for some of you, including the Scott Fish Bowl, that if I survive to round 3. Are you in the playoffs in the Scott Fish Bowl, Eric?
I am not. I built around Dak Prescott and Justin Fields, so the combination of the slow start and the trip to IR dug me a hole that I couldn't make my way out of. So made a late surge, but came up a game short.
Well, it's all in good fun and charity, so that's okay. I'm in round 2 of the playoffs, so Justin Fields return. I survived Justin Fields not playing last week. I have him as well. So I am looking to advance again to week 3. So we'll check into that next week. Thank you for everybody for your questions in the chat and for listening to Eric and I. Make sure you follow me at JAC3600. We are usually on Saturday nights. We've done a couple of Friday night shows. We'll let you know in advance any schedule changes that happen here. And you can check out my work at Football Diehards and at Fantasy Pros every week. Eric, where can they find you?
Yeah, you can also find me here for the Football Diehards. You can find all of my written work over at drroto.com. And you can find a lot of my video work at Green Screens Media on Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube. That's where we have the Pros with Joe's podcast. That's where we break down some World Cup now that this is the season. That's where we do a lot of college basketball work. So Green Screens Media if you want to see or hear me some more.
Awesome. Who wouldn't? I'd want to see you and hear you all the time, Eric. And we'll check in. Eric runs that amazing Pros versus Joe's thing, so we'll check in on that next week because that's getting into the playoffs now too. I missed it.
Next week is the playoffs. Yeah.
My partner and I will not be participating in the playoffs for that week. But it's been a lot of fun. We got one more quick question: Debo or Kamara in the flex? I think I'm saying Kamara there, even in a tough matchup. We talked about Debo. For me, looks in danger of even missing that game or not being involved as much. So I'm taking Kamara there. What about you?
I will as well, right? The counterpunch to that tough Bucks run defense is a running back that can catch the ball out of the backfield,
Yep.
and Kamara does that pretty well still.
That he does. All right. Thank you for sneaking that last minute question in there. We're going to sign off for now. We will see you next weekend. We're going to stay Saturday night at 9 o'clock Eastern, live on YouTube. Bring your questions. Be ready to talk week 14 with us, and we will see you then. For Eric, I'm Jamie. We will see you next time. Thank you for joining.